Hello and welcome to Future Building. I'm Mathew Aitchison and I'm Professor at Monash University and CEO of Building 4.0 CRC. In this podcast, we take a broad look at buildings and building in contemporary society and what's coming down the pipeline in the future. We'll talk with invited guests and experts in the field, where we'll cover news and trends along with research and developments in the industry. Future Building is proudly sponsored by Building 4.0 CRC. Welcome back to part 2 of our episode on Californian housing reform. If you haven't heard the interview with Californian State Assembly member Buffy Wicks from last week, I urge you to go back and have a listen. Assembly member Wicks is leading the initiative from the Californian government side, but in preparing the ideas which will soon go up for debate, the Californian government has been working together with a research and advocacy group called the Terner Center for Housing Innovation and its affiliate Terner Labs, both at the University of California, Berkeley. It's the Terner Center who are charged with preparing the white paper we spoke about last week. Today, we get to speak with one of the key researchers on the project from the Terner side, Tyler Pullen. So in part 1, if we went high level with Assembly member Wicks, today, with Tyler, we'll get into some of the detail and really get under the hood of this white paper that they have produced. Just to remind people that some of the really unusual parts of the reforms that were outlined in this white paper was really a focus around reducing construction costs and on building innovation more generally. Two things that our guest, Tyler, is expert on. I first met Tyler Pullen back in 2023 when I traveled to Berkeley to reconnect with the Terner Center after a 6-year hiatus. I think what's unusual about the Terner Center and what Tyler and I get into is its breadth. It could legitimately be a fairly traditional policy-focused housing lab, but it actually has a much broader remit that includes the modes and methods of housing production, new housing ventures, and an interest in the industry that stands behind these things. That bet on going wide has certainly been effective, and I think the white paper we're going to talk and preview today is proof of that. But I would also say that it's not just enough to go wide. You also need to have good ideas and great researchers who can match that breadth. What struck me about Tyler when I first met him back in 2023, and then when he went on to deliver a keynote at Building 4.0 CRC's annual conference back in 2024, was how broad his knowledge is, how fluently he crosses across the various disciplines that are essential for any meaningful housing reform. A little more about Tyler before we get to the interview. Tyler leads Terner Labs' work in the building industry and housing space, which includes supporting building entrepreneurs through Terner's Housing Venture Lab. He also guides research on building industry innovation within the broader group at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. Don't worry if this all sounds confusing, because we are going to unpack the Terner universe for you a little bit in a little while. And finally, on Tyler, I would just say, and perhaps this is not surprising, he has a really broad interdisciplinary background in research and practice, which spans several disciplines, including architecture, planning, engineering, and construction. I love Tyler's energy. I love the concepts that we discussed, and it's always such a pleasure to talk to someone who's such an expert in the field. I hope you enjoy our interview. I spoke with Tyler from his office in Oakland in March 2026. Tyler Pullen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tyler, our last episode was with Californian State Assembly member Buffy Wicks, who, as you know full well, is chairing the Californian housing reform from the government side. And now I and our listeners have the pleasure of talking with you. And I'm really excited about that because I really want to get into the detail of what you and the team have included in the white paper and, of course, why. But before we get to that, I'd like to give our listeners a little more perspective on you and the center where you work, the Terner Center for Housing Innovation, and, of course, Terner Labs. Perhaps I could ask you to start by explaining the Terner universe.
Sure, and it is a multiverse. So the Terner Center is the half of our Ternerverse that is anchored at UC Berkeley. That is a formal research institute dedicated to providing practical, relevant, timely research for housing industry practitioners and policymakers that is balancing like academic rigor with actual relevant info in formats that are digestible to lay people. Terner Labs is a nonprofit spinoff we made a bit ago to be able to do a little bit more active programming in the housing industry. And in particular, there's two main anchor programs we run through the nonprofit, which has no formal university affiliation. One of which is an accelerator program for people innovating in the housing industry, both generally, this could be people doing a new financing schema for missing middle housing and other things, or folks directly innovating in the building industry itself. So, how we build and deliver the homes that people actually live in. Then the second program is called the Data Labs, and that is housing our policy simulator, which is a means of adding some honesty and transparency to local land use decisions. So oftentimes when we change zoning, it is off the general vibe of raising height restrictions or increasing density minimums or maximum allowable density in certain areas in the hopes that the housing will come. And the big question is enough housing will come to maintain certain levels of affordability. And this tool goes off of housing market data, various public sources of data to essentially stress test certain assumptions. So, a tool or model for actually changing some of the levers that local planners have and making more educated guesses or simulations of the actual expected housing that would be built over a 10-year span from those decisions. So, two very different programs, but yeah, ways to get more involved in actual housing decision making.
Oh, that's fantastic, Tyler. But so how big a faux pas am I committing if I just simply refer to all of that as the Turner?
I do that exact thing. I conveniently straddle both sides of Terner, so I keep a capital T, the Terner, around all the time.
Excellent. And you also mentioned designing policy by vibes, which I have come across once or twice in other parts of the world. So don't feel that that's only a Californian phenomenon. Um, Tyler, you and I have known each other for a few years now, but I certainly don't feel like I know everything about you. But I know that our listeners would enjoy if you could tell us a little bit about your professional journey to the present.
We have that in common. I also don't know everything about me. I have followed a relatively consistent through line on theme, which has left me to pinball massively around within the building industry over the years. So teenage me wanted to solve climate change. That felt like a pretty big problem, and I wanted to throw myself at it. And saw an engineering program, specifically civil and environmental engineering, saw the word environment, and I was like, well, that's pretty intuitive. That's obviously addressing climate change. And so went and did a bachelor's degree in that. Eventually realized that that actually is not what environmental engineering is. It's a lot about wastewater management and water resource management, which I enjoyed, but was not what I was looking for in particular. And so followed through into a master's, basically got class and very little industry experience in the different silos we have in the building industry. So there was some more kind of structural engineering, some energy efficiency modeling and architecture, some construction management work. And then what I came to eventually learn was urban planning. And being in the Bay Area of California and San Francisco in particular, everything you could possibly care about, if you spend enough time here, you find an excuse to make it be housing, whether it's education, climate change, or various social issues we have here. It all connects to housing without too much creative connecting of the dots. And so the more I got involved in that, the more I tried to find this woven through line with construction innovation and specifically industrialized construction. There are many different buzzwords to use to refer to almost the same space. But it felt like this holy synthesis of the different fragments of the building industry with a particular potential for optimizing on factors that are usually lost in translation, like on cost, on embodied carbon, on designing buildings with actual data from building performance to ensure the energy efficiency features we're putting in place are actually effective in practice and in during occupancy. And so I kept following that thread. It's like, oh, it's done it. And this industrialized construction thing really captures a lot of what I think is missing in the building industry. But it seems to keep, especially entrepreneurs in the US, keep running into walls of bad financing environments or housing and zoning policies that cause friction in ways that are obtuse to a lot of the folks coming at it from a technical standpoint on the engineering side. And so the more I pulled that thread, the more I realized none of my mentors, peers were interested or able to answer, like do that translation of what is the kind of technology side and engineering side of innovation, and where does that meet policy and housing industry dynamics in particular, in the vein of getting more housing more affordably across the US and really the world, but especially in California. And so landed myself at UC Berkeley and at Turner and have been here the last 5.5 years with largely the inverse, which was a bunch of housing people who had worked in policy and development space and were like, man, this offsite construction thing seems really cool, but we don't really know what to make of it or why it isn't working, right as my application came through the pipe. So I have found some other enthusiastic, curious misfits, and tried to kind of centralize or converge on this aura of how to make housing more affordable and more sustainable through the lens of policy and industry practice in the building industry.
Excellent, Tyler. You've given us some really interesting little gems there that I'm going to come back to in a minute. But you you've already outlined the centrality of housing in California. And when we had Assembly Member Wicks on the show last week, I asked her to set the scene for the audience who's probably not as familiar with the situation in California as we are. But I want to ask you the same question. How would you describe both the current state of play in California and the journey to this moment that we're currently experiencing over the past few decades?
A good question. I think the pithiest way to answer is California is a lot like other places, only more so. And so our housing affordability crisis, our financing and policy fragmented bureaucratic regime has been more labyrinthian and more longstanding than a lot of places. So suffice to say, a lot of the problems we talk about as being urgent and quite frankly a measure of crises are longstanding. We took a long time to get here, and it's very likely will take a while to get out. But in that particular vein, around folks not being able to afford homes near job opportunities, having to commute multiple hours each way, in traffic, out of traffic, living 50, 60, 70 kilometers well outside of major employment zones, and then having still to spend a disproportionately high amount of their income on rent, or home ownership, and frankly, less people being even open to the option of home ownership because of the stresses in our housing market, have been a long time coming, and there's many contributing factors. The one I focus on at Turner and in general is how rising construction costs, which also has many contributing factors, changes the development feasibility of what housing gets built, ultimately limiting the amount of housing we build, and then having that supply and demand mismatch that we know results in greater levels of homelessness, rent burden, all of the bad things. And so the particular angle here is that our construction costs have been higher and rising faster than other places for a long time, especially the last 2 decades or so, as far as I've seen tracked. And that has led to desperation. Desperation is a key
Yeah.
contributor, a key ingredient to how we got here and where we're at now. And that has come from a lot of the Silicon Valley optimism of new companies with lots of money and sometimes an idea of what they're actually doing, giving the usual really attractive slide deck pitch of we are here to revolutionize construction, and there's been productivity stagnation compared to every other industry, and uh, construction costs are rising as a result, and we're not getting more workforce, and blah blah blah. Um, we've heard a lot of the pitches. There's certainly economic opportunity and investment opportunity there, But we've had a lot of pretty high profile failures on top of that. Folks who
Yeah.
underestimate the complexity of the housing industry and the building industry writ large, whether or not they're coming from one fragment of it or they're coming from completely outside of that industry. It's hard. We have not made it easy to change how things are done, even as we're all complaining about the way things are done. And so um, that has led to this particular moment of like, there are enough projects and enough companies doing good things with just enough evidence that, okay, there's a there in this innovative construction space, but enough negative stories that there's a bunch of people that are still a bit tepid. And that includes developers who are expected to adopt these innovations, but also policymakers that see desperately looking for silver bullets and panaceas in every direction, whether it be streamlining permitting or upzoning or offsite construction, who at least have dug deep enough in the last 5 to 10 years in California to realize, okay, it's not that easy an answer, or it's not a silver bullet, it's a piece of the puzzle. And there's some aggressively in the weeds, nerdy topics like building codes reform that are holding us back. And really, that's just taken time. It's taken successes and
Yeah.
failures. It's taken people from both sides, whether their company failed or they're at one of the companies still standing, just filtering into the rest of the industry and talking more and more at conferences and connecting to each other more and speaking more with one voice on what's needed and what the friction points are. So I won't say it's a good reason that we are here, because it definitely comes from desperate times and desperate need. But I think we are waist deep now, where we were kind of dipping our toes for a while and not quite sure what we were doing.
That's certainly my feeling. I said in the last episode with Assembly Member Wicks that it really feels like we're having a kind of moment. And I want to go back in a minute and sort of retrace some of the steps that led to this moment. But just to set that scene, you've spoken about construction costs quite a bit, which was one of the original reasons that this initiative that you're involved in caught my attention. Can you just outline for an international audience the difference between construction costs, let's say in the Bay Area where you currently are, and an example that was consistently used while I was recently in the States, let's say Idaho? What is the square foot difference in construction costs? What's the range that you've heard about and would expect to be true?
It's a good question. I am still in the thralls of trying to discipline myself to not use per square foot, because I think
Oh,
that's
it's fraught. I know,
it's
but
fraught. There's
it's still
no
the
metric is perfect. So I will say I've like intentionally distanced myself from that metric, but not to judge anyone. I know it's a standard and I am being inconvenient and contrarian. But I think the number typically see, or at least that sticks out in my head, in California, we could be looking at 500,000, $750,000 per unit, which could be a studio, one bedroom, two bedroom. So that metric is also imperfect, but about half a million or close to a million per unit in some of the high cost metros. So San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles being the obvious ones. Even within California, that can look like a few $100,000 a unit in more rural or suburban areas. Of course, it's a different type of housing, so it's not a perfect comparison. And then in more rural parts of the country, and I don't know specifically about Idaho, but speaking with a really wide paintbrush here, you could see homes delivered for 100, $200,000
yeah,
for sale. And I will say, like, even in California, there are exceptions, of course, in both directions. It's not every unit that's close to $1 million per unit for full development costs, but there are, won't get too into the weeds, ways of delivering housing, especially accessory dwelling units or backyard units, that sometimes combine federal building code and offsite construction and are able to hit like 100,000, 150,000 on the very low end of construction if it's not feasible everywhere, of course, and getting the housing that we can afford to build in the places that most need it built is a constant tension. But yeah, suffice to say, it's a very broad range, and California is notoriously high for a bunch of reasons that some of our research tries to unpack. But that is some of the sentiment beyond California is like a lot of other places, only more so. Because everyone's complaining about high
Yeah,
costs, but ours are highest, not to brag or anything.
yeah, yeah. No, it's obviously relative, and those figures tally with what I was told when I was over there recently, somewhere between 2.5 to 4 times the cost of, let's say, rural or sort of regional areas, as opposed to sort of metro higher end apartments. But I think you're dead right, by the way, to focus on unit costs rather than square feet. It's a terrible metric, especially when you get into smaller
Exactly.
apartment sizes, which would be an entire episode on its own, Tyler, if we were to go into
Yep.
breakdown of cost. I just want to move now into the relationship that's been established between the government and your center.
Hmm.
I mean, as we know, Tyler, the government's reforming building or even housing policies is not infrequent. It happens all the time, everywhere. But as I discussed with Assembly Member Wicks last week, it seems to me that in 2025, and maybe this is supported by your description of the moment that we're having at the moment, in 2025, it seems that something different started to happen in the state of California. I'm not sure if there was something in the water. Maybe it was a strong dose of abundance. Uh, Maybe it was your governor, Gavin Newsom. But one of the things that happened is that the government started to engage with you guys, and it seems to me, from the outside, as someone who's looked on at this over the last couple of months, that you've really struck up a good working relationship with the government. How did that come about, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, the short version is for better and for worse, the world still largely runs on human to human relationships, sometimes frighteningly so, sometimes in corrupt ways, but sometimes just in we have a finite number of humans we can know. And there turns out there's a lot of us who are doing a lot of good work very fragmentedly. And that is especially true in housing and the building industry, where there are unusually large rifts between academia, industry, within industry, from industry to policymakers. The number of policymakers themselves and legislative staff that have never been on a job site or worked in the construction industry on any part of our siloed, like from contractor to sub to architect, engineer. I've never been in the room with all of those entities in one room to know how these people talk to each other and interact. Um, I think even more so in this particular space, it depends a lot on human relationships. And so in Terner's
Hmm.
case, it's astonishing to me continuously to remember that Turner Center, I should say, at the university was only founded about 10 years ago. We literally just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, Turnerversary, because we're really cool and funny. Uh, and it started with two humans, Carol Galante and Carolina Reed. Carol Galante was a big wig in some federal housing administration, big wig in Bay Area housing development, working for a big affordable housing developer out here. So she had this career's worth of connections and momentum, and honestly, pent up frustration and anger at how the system works and how it doesn't. And she reached out to Carolina Reed, who's a tenured professor at UC Berkeley in the planning department and brilliant on all things kind of community reinvestment mechanisms at the federal level into housing mostly. Uh, but basically with the idea that there is a bunch of good research, there is a bunch of in-house knowledge, if you excuse the pun, for practitioners that have good policy ideas, and there's no one really connecting these dots. And so Carol and Carolina basically lit and then carried the torch for the first 5 or so years before Carol officially retired for the first of two or three times. And Carolina still works, serves as our kind of faculty advisor and advises a lot of the quality research we've put out. But just in that 10 years, it was maybe five, six, seven people working full time for Turner Center for the first 5 or 6 years. We have since then spawned Turner Labs, this nonprofit, and ballooned to 35 to 40 people across both Turners
Hmm.
now, just in the last 5 years. I am one of those people, thankfully. And as such, like we've connected really smart, passionate people that are desperate about enacting actual change in industry and policy, and not trivially had a lot of good staff retention. Like these people have continued doing the research on certain themes that are relevant and cross-cutting compared to academic research, and put a lot of effort into building the relationships with everyone from minor to medium staffers to some of the politicians themselves, especially at the state level, to help them make more informed decisions. Housing is infamously complex. Policy is not easy. These are often folks who have not worked in any part of the industry before. And so, really, they're just looking for someone with a friendly face and neutral
Mm,
information, and they're not selling anything. And Terner
yeah.
has found a really increasingly reliable niche in that space. Like we'll tell it how it is. We're not advocating for any certain policy, but we aggregate information as best we can with honesty and rigor and a high work ethic. And then we just continue being in the rooms where people are using our information to make those actual decisions and providing color and nuance, where a lot of other researchers or industry practitioners are kind of speaking with overwrought authority or staying decidedly within their lane in ways that kind of limit the relationship building aspect that tends to drive a lot of how change happens.
Y- Yeah, look, you point to something there that I think is really fundamental and something I've observed in the work that we do and visiting other successful labs around the world is really that independence. It's so difficult in our industry to actually get solid independent advice,
Hmm.
which was, such a joy, I think, for me to see a government working hand in hand with an establishment like your own to really get inside the problem in a way that isn't being jaundiced by commercial interests or
Hmm.
lobbying interests or whatever they may be. But I would also say, Tyler, that it's not easy for governments to work with the research fraternity, right?
No,
They're,
yeah,
they're, they're fundamentally different things.
yeah.
What do you think it is beyond the things that you've just mentioned about the Turner philosophy that's really made this collaboration possible? I mean, you mentioned before you and the other misfits. I'm not sure that all of them would refer to themselves as misfits, but to me, it seems like all of the people I've ever met in the Turner Center are kind of world-leading experts and extremely competent in their respective areas. What is the philosophy that's made this collaboration possible?
Yeah, and it's funny, I had always grown up and lived thinking Misfits was a good thing. Uh, I've seen the news headlines, and being normal does not seem like all it's cracked up to be. So I say Misfits with absolute love and adoration. But
I know you do.
yeah, I do think that that really does come down to it for us internally, but then also externally. I think it's both. There's like a layer of competence that we typically assign that's like, oh, people that are hardworking, they have degrees from really big name universities, or they're technically competent, or they communicate well. And I think that all is true in a really generic but obviously extremely valuable way uh, for us as individuals and as a collective. And certainly we've made each other stronger too. Like our research team, which I'm thankful to be a part of, regularly vets and brainstorms on research proposals, on how to frame outcomes, on what actual policy suggestions do exist for particularly um, difficult issue areas that don't have obvious answers or a lot of evidence. And so, like, not just working with individually competent people, but uplifting each other through our collective confidence. And then the thing I actually want to say is having that scrutiny for people that we research with and get information from and interface with. And so, if you've ever been part of research interviews or workshops, some people love to fill up the space in the room. Sometimes that is with
Mm,
really valuable information. Sometimes that is with them loving the sound of their own voice. And
hmm.
it sounds like a really qualitative, kind of trivial or petty thing. And yet, like that tends to be a huge difference between good and bad research, or
Yeah.
really nuanced, in the weeds feedback versus really overconfident conclusions or oversimplifications of complex housing industry dynamics. And so also part of our collective strength, I think, as individuals is like we have slowly cobbled together a lot of other, I mean, I'm gonna keep saying it, misfits, but like people that are frustrated but passionate and visionary and creative, and usually super generous with their time, at working together to create solutions and to provide feedback even when we send reports out in draft form that is not like you got this wrong, but like the person who puts in the extra effort to be like, oh, I'm not sure if I misunderstood this, or this seems to connect to this earlier point, or have been misconstrued, and oh, here is actually a lead up to a policy idea I had that you might want to consider. Like it is truly
Yeah.
collaborative in and outside of Turner, and that to me is like the actual fuel that I need to come up with better non-biofuel analogies, but like that's the actual fuel that keeps the engine running. Like it's not just
No,
us being competent, but
I
yeah.
sorry to
No, no,
talk
no,
over
go
the
for
top
it.
of you. Look, I completely agree. I mean, it's very evident that it is this very collaborative, reaching out approach that you have with a really high attention to quality and detail about it. And it's absolutely not the kind of gotcha, policy stuff that we often see. That the housing policy and the housing debate is fraught with this kind of material. So I
Mhm.
really congratulate you for that, and I think clearly that philosophy has paid off. We were talking before about the moment in 2025, and I think the other thing that I'm going to hypothesize emerged in 2025, and I think what was striking about Assemblymember Wicks's presentation at Stanford a few weeks back that we saw was this very deep talk about construction costs and building innovation. Now, in a way, that focus mirrors, I think, your own CV and biography. But for someone like me, I just really want to mark that again and say I go to a lot of these conferences. And I have to say, this is pretty unusual. I'm really, when we get into the discussion around how we really increase housing supply, coming at it from a position of production or that perspective, I'm really used to seeing people on stage tell us that it's some new technology that's going to unlock or disrupt the industry, or that prefab is the answer, or
Mhm.
that we need to build more factories, or things like that.
Mhm.
And the current approach in California that I think builds on this moment that you are having is very different. And so the question I have for you, Tyler, is what role do you think the Turner played in all of this?
Very good question. I think as a direct extension of what you just asked previously, it was being the one of the first points of contact for Buffy Wicks's office and Buffy Wicks herself. And the initial idea that she had in her mind for forming a select committee, a special committee basically to hear a lot more substance and dive deeper into this particular policy area to inform more strategic and impactful bills. We were one of her first points of contact. We actually responded. We were, believe it or not, generous with our time when one of the most influential state legislators came in and said, last year was the time for land use reform, and we got a bunch of stuff through that people said would not be possible, including some big landmark stuff around environmental review and how that often gets weaponized against housing in California and elsewhere. And now the next obvious target is construction costs and how what policy can do to address it. And so I will admit she came in with some of the lens of like, so 3D printing, so prefab, so robotics and construction, what's the there? And we're super thankful she saw us, I mean, knew of us and knew that we had some presence and footprint in this space to be like, is there a there? And like, what is it?
Mm.
Both in terms of literally the companies, like what are the businesses I should be looking to get good advice? And then also the actual people at and outside of those companies, like who will give me the honest answer, tell me candidly about a project that didn't go well, but put it in the context of a bunch of other projects that did go well. Tell me without being too selfish about it, like what policy ideas would really move the needle on certain construction innovations being able to reduce costs and increase the supply and quality of housing. Um, and that is, yeah, there are still people who are representing for-profit private entities that we had in sort of our Rolodex that we recommended them talking to, but it was still, and this is to the question of like kind of qualitative discernment that has built a lot of our reputation. It was still the people who are not giving advice with the sole commercial interest of their business, or recommending things that
Hmm.
are not just the immediate band-aid or the immediate friction point solve, but who are asking questions just as much as they are providing insight and answers. And so, in a really direct way, like we helped them find those people. We helped organize a tour for a few of the state legislators to go to Sweden to see some of the
Mm.
factories and see some of the policy in action there, where I think a lot actually does translate across building industries internationally. Plenty doesn't. We are not socialist, and yet they still talk about fragmented trades and aging and shrinking workforce and construction technology in largely a similar way as we do here. So, came with a trip. It came with actually setting up a bunch of interviews and workshops with people in the US to talk about and actually really unpack the friction points, like get beneath the surface level that so many reports often do. That's like building codes are a problem or
Mm.
financing timelines are an issue, but like spend 2 hours with 8 people who have direct opinions on that to get at the question of, okay, but exactly how do you recommend fixing it? What is the state legislative role? What regulation needs to change? Who would be angry about this change? So we got those constructive people in the room, collected that
Yeah,
feedback, aggregated it, reflected it as neutrally as we could, and tried to lay it out in the context of a finite but still large number of policy ideas that were surfaced in all of that work. And so
excellent.
all of this is described really quickly. It was a frightening, like 6 month turnaround or so from Buffy being in our email inbox to us having helped plan the trip with them, run all these research workshops and interviews, and just today published the actual white paper with a lot of this feedback we heard baked into it. So, trail
Excellent,
guide
excellent.
is
Well, look,
the
I want.
best analogy I've come up with for all of that.
But that's great. I mean, sometimes, obviously, we need to be dynamic and we need to be agile and we need to mold to the moment. We're going to get very briefly, we're going to shortly get into the white paper itself and the methodology that you guys use to put it all together. But just sort of finishing up on this part of the relationship between government and research and the Turner Center specifically. It's a really broad sweep, if you like, to go from a traditional government or even a public debate focus on land use and permitting and all of the usual suspects in that area,
Mhm,
right across to construction costs and innovation and zooming out from even that, the means of production.
mhm.
I just want to ask the question before we get to that white paper. Is that sweep too broad, or are there risks in being that holistic, in your opinion?
In terms of trying to capture a really broad swath of like technologies or approaches to this, or
Yeah, well, that's right. So, I mean, sorry, I should back up a little bit and explain that a little bit. When we were talking with Assembly Member Wicks and some of her staff in the lead up to the interview we did a week ago, it was clear to me that she was seeing this as a sort of a multi-year plan, and
yeah.
that a lot of work had been done on permitting and land use, and now we're, as you described yourself, we're moving across the sort of, you know, the across the field now into another area that's been underexplored.
Mhm,
But w the work that's happening around, for example, building innovation, construction costs, focus on the means of production is not happening now in isolation from those issues around permitting and land use.
yeah.
It's kind of all happening together.
Yeah.
Now, I guess what I'm sort of suggesting here,
Mhm.
and obviously you and I know each other, and so you probably already know what my answer or take is on this, but I do want to put it to you that there may be critics that say that, look, this is a really broad suite of policies that the government is working on here. Is it too broad,
Yeah,
and does
yeah.
it risk being too diffuse?
Yeah, yeah. that is a question we should constantly ask ourselves. I think something I love to keep in mind, well, I actually hate keeping it in mind, but something that's important to keep in mind is what the status quo is. And
Yeah.
the status quo is untenable. It is a housing crisis and a climate crisis and a homelessness crisis, and probably a few more that I'm forgetting about, that aren't solving themselves in the policy space, in the industry and entrepreneurship space. And so I think a phrase one of my colleagues actually likes that we haven't come up with a better example for is the what's the best way to eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I think
Yeah.
housing in
I'm
particular.
familiar with that metaphor, and as soon as anyone out there listening has a better one, they should let both of us
Yes,
know because
please.
I too use it and wish I hadn't. But carry on.
Please, yes. But in the sense that housing and building industry stuff in particular, partially because it is so fragmented and so legacy driven, uh, I think there's a tendency to think like we can't solve any particular piece of it without solving all of it at once. And both are true.
Hmm.
Like we have discrete people and attention spans and legislative cycles and points of decision making where I'm have been glad that Buffy has been super explicit, even for the bills that are impending in this current cycle around the research we did, that this is going to be a multi-year, probably a multi-decade effort. And there will be interesting questions even of like when is the payoff? When do we know a certain policy was successful or a certain company even was successful? There's almost philosophical questions embedded in that. But I think by virtue of us having limited time and the kind of rusty machinery of our current form of democracy, I think it needs to be cordoned off into certain digestible sections. And I will say, not trivially, like one of the highest points of my career has been having a room full of legitimate state legislators get excited about building code reform and know just enough about what I mean by building code reform to go into like ankle deep territory in talking about why it's a problem and what to do about it. And that alone, even 5 years ago, even hearing the phrase building codes on the mouth of politicians would have been hard to imagine. And so getting them into the weeds with us, with the people in industry, with the researchers, spending a lot of time with them as well, I think discreet as some of these options may be, and as surgical as some of the interventions may be, there is a need to break problems down into digestible pieces for
Hmm.
actual action and to be honest, to not be super intimidated or just completely nihilistic, which is also a risk in these times.
Yes, I think you really touch on something really fundamental and indeed philosophical, as you say there, Tyler, that I just want to take a minute to recount. And I think it is a fundamental paradox of innovation in the building sector more generally, and this obviously applies to housing, is that the whole thing is so big and so complex and so huge that it makes it difficult to create that kind of holistic systemic change. And so the natural reaction would be to focus on a part and stay in a lane and choose one's battles.
Yeah.
And yet we've seen that latter path not work out for decades now. And so I think as I said before, you probably already knew my personal position on this, but I think I hear that in your response is that no, we need to take the bold route, which is to take on the whole, as big and as messy and as complex and contingent as it may be.
And I do love when the bold route is with such wild, crazy modern ideas. Like, have you tried collaborating? Have you tried talking to other people in other parts of the industry to
Yeah,
like
it's not rocket science. There's another metaphor for you that's overused. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're dead right. But how rare is it, right?
Yeah.
How rare is
Yeah.
it? And I think this is what we're seeing in your relationship. between the Terner and the government. It's quite rare, and yet it appears at this early stage to be quite effective. So I find all of this incredibly buoying, and it gives me a lot of optimism for the future. But apart from my own views on all of this stuff, we need to progress, Tyler. So I want to get to the white paper, which is the star of the show. As you would well know, and as you mentioned before, when I interviewed Assemblymember Wicks last week, it wasn't yet released. I'd had a chance to have a look at it. I've now had a proper chance to go through it. What I will say, if that wasn't already evident, is that I really enjoyed this straight line, if you like, in the report that links the lack of supply with high costs, with a lack of innovation, and indeed what you might say as an application of new ideas more generally. I think the report is really clear on that, and I commend you and your fellow authors for it. I do want to get into some of the recommendations and I want to get your view on it, but I first would like you to briefly outline the process that you started to foreshadow earlier, that you and the
Mhm.
team undertook to pull it together. And I should also take the time to spell out that it's not a list of recommendations made by the Turner, but rather a curation of ideas, I would say, that have arisen from the interviews and workshops that you did. Is that a correct assumption there, Tyler?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And though it's been a short-term process, I can say the rough sequence was confirming the sincerity of Buffy Wicks and the other legislators' interest back in late summer, early fall, I guess, which already feels like a couple of years ago. Essentially making sure, especially because it started with, oh, we want to do a study tour to Sweden. There was a version of that that they just wanted to take a trip to Sweden and use campaign funds to do it while ostensibly learning some things that they might take back to California. And so the initial pulse checks were mainly like, we'll lean into this. Like, we will make this a capital R research effort and put way too much bandwidth into it in the near term if you are actually sincere about wanting to like push informed legislation in this space and use the information we could get from making this a research effort directly. And so that was the earliest feature, and pretty much from that point on, and that was yeah maybe September, October-ish. It was a all hands on deck from the few hands we had to put on deck. But specific call out to my colleagues Stephanie Hawk and Julie Aguilar, who really stepped up to throw together a spreadsheet of who are the people we should talk to. Let's make sure it's a representative sample. Let's have a group of developers, for profit, of capital A affordable using public subsidy dollars, of people doing factory built housing or offsite construction, some folks who have done panelized, some volumetric modular. Let's get some folks doing 3D printing. Let's at least talk to them and see if there is potential there or what the friction points are that are in common or different. And then after forging that large spreadsheet, actually doing the outreach and the honestly the hardest part of any project, scheduling, we had I think just under 70 people we talked to in one-on-one interviews or workshops, desperately trying to meet the schedule availability of everyone in about 2 weeks in December,
Wow.
where everyone was on holiday break. And then sort of forwent our holiday break to cobble all of that feedback together, do the coding and qualitative analysis to accurately reflect this is what we heard. And a lot of the workshops were semi-structured in the sense that like we had also a list of ideas from existing papers we had done, from other literature, from previous conversations, from conversations with folks who had come through our accelerator program that had told us and taught us a lot about how the industry works and how it doesn't. And so, like, a lot of it was developed with direct reflection of people that have been teaching us in this space for years, and then getting to dive deeper with a lot of those same people and like, okay, now tell us why this is a good idea or a bad idea. And then the white paper is essentially a good excuse to like write up what we heard. And yes, try
Hmm.
to corroborate where we can for where there is evidence in other states, in other locales, in other countries, Australia included, for not saying this is a bad policy idea or a good one, but just trying to connect the dots of where there is precedent and what evidence exists, and then reflect the additional feedback we got to hear through the workshops of what could go wrong, who would get angry, what about the mechanics of this policy or other intervention would cause new points of friction or just change the frontier of problems. So
Hmm. Yeah.
fast as it was, is still a high quality research output that could not have been possible without my colleagues, and a lot of the people, again, being really generous with their time and being willing to meet us in our time of need and in Buffy Wicks's time of need. So,
Excellent. Look, let's go now to the white paper itself. There are
mhm,
seven major themes that you report on, that were workshopped, that were tabled in the various interviews. Obviously, we won't have time here to go through all seven of them.
mhm.
Previously, you've done a little bit of my work for me in sort of summarizing the broad objectives, and I will just go through these.
Mhm.
Broadly, objectives being to reduce friction in the building codes and their enforcement, which we've spoken about already, targeting certainty and financing support. And one of the key ideas here that you've pointed out to me is really around that idea of backstopping development risk. Um, there is a push to improve alignment with existing funding streams across the state and across government. And finally, something that caught my eye, the establishment of a research and education program.
Mhm.
Tyler, is that still a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it's the case with any research output. That like 2 weeks from now, I will probably have come up with a more coherent way to organize those things. But yeah, that covers most of it, and I think is a pretty direct reflection of where we heard some of the biggest opportunities for state intervention are.
So, of the seven, which one of those are you most excited about?
Ooh, it's a good question. I
And
think
we can interpret excited in many different ways. It might be which one do you think is most novel, or which one do you think will
Mhm.
be most impactful, or which one in the group caused the most consternation between yourselves and your partners in government. Um, Feel free to take some latitude in answering that question.
Such good sub questions. Though I do love the impulse to interpret excited as agitated. I think I do have an honest, direct answer with the enthusiastic excitement. Uh, and I can say this personally because I'm not allowed to have policy opinions as a Terner employee, but the I think vision for an actual physical and digital like anchor space for research and development to me has been sort of a pet project for even earlier version of our accelerator program was originally envisioned to have a physical facility with both prototyping for innovators themselves, like working in new materials who need quick turnarounds to see what new assembly method or material is code compliant, and then actually have better data before they try to raise money for a new factory on how much it would cost to build and how many they can build in a day and what the ultimate home cost would be for some of these things. There really isn't a space for that in the
Yeah.
US, but in many countries. And then also, I think more symbolically and probably more importantly, even though it's hard to tie metrics to it, is like have a place people go to. We started by talking about Turner's kind of whole existence, reputation, and value is based off of being this neutral clearinghouse, separating signal from the noise and housing policy and innovation space. Uh, there's a lot of signal and a lot of noise in the offsite construction, innovative construction space in particular, and not really a place for people to go, certainly not from multiple facets of the industry or across public and private sector. And so just having an actual physical space people can go into, touch, feel, see what we're talking about when we're talking
Mm.
about industrialized construction, which is such an unknowingly esoteric phrase, uh, and see what quality controlled environment and processes look like compared to on-site construction. See the excitement of people who got jobs to work at places like this and do fabrication, and see how they are not folks who would have otherwise been on the construction industry or on site in construction. if not for these new employment opportunities. Like actually bringing people together in spaces like that and anchoring research and education, which is very hard in this fragmented industry, to a place that people can be inspired and get excited and not just hear about the nth project that is over cost or over budget, regardless of whether or not it was innovative. I see as such a game-changing value for how we better connect academia, industry, policy, practice in the housing industry and especially building industry, but also just a place for people to tinker and learn in real time and not just keep it at the highfalutin kind of overconfident claims of new company websites.
Yeah, look, and I was also buoyed by Assembly Member Wicks's both her keynote and in the interview the support that was clearly being offered for such a program, which included, the idea of a physical location, which I think for all the reasons you've just outlined is super important. But let's also get back, Tyler, to some of the core recommendations. I want to start
Yeah.
with code reform.
Yeah.
How would you go about describing what you heard in the workshops in relation to the need for code reform?
Yeah. This is a rare moment that conveniently the themes that came through across multiple categories, I think are pretty easy to summarize is just any effort to increase the certainty in the process of delivering housing. And that's true across financing, permitting, building codes, interpretation, and inspection. So, for the building codes piece in particular, I think the helpful context is we generally operate in the US on a prescriptive-based code environment. My favorite analogy for that is food recipe. Instead of saying we just need a meal that has this number of calories and this amount of nutrients, we say like you are baking a three cheese lasagna with this particular meat, and here are the exact 1, 2, 3 through 13 steps you need to get here. And that can have advantages of lowering the workforce requirement for on-skill labor and for inspectors to be more sure that these are tried and true prescriptive codes, meeting compliance standards. But then we undermined a lot of the advantage of that potential approach to building codes by fragmenting it across local jurisdictions. And so we start
Hmm.
with an independently developed model code from the International Code Council at the national level. Uh, Most states more or less adopt that model code directly with some adjustments. And then states have a variety of a patchwork of regulations, whether or not the state code is the only base code for everything in the state, or whether or not local jurisdictions are free to add or remove or just generally change that state model code. California is one of the states that allows adjustment up from the state model code. So you have to meet the state code at a minimum, but you are allowed to add things like additional requirements for snow load or wind load in certain jurisdictions.
Hmm.
The problem with that is we have a comically fragmented patchwork of jurisdictions. So the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, typically seen and described as one region, certainly with one sort of collective housing market and fate, has 108 different jurisdictions with 108 different city councils, planning departments, you name it. And each of those having slightly different planning, zoning codes, and building codes makes it really difficult for a factory desperately interested in providing housing to address the whole regional housing crisis if they have to make adjustments to their plans, their designs, and their actual fabrication processes for two buildings being built 2 blocks from each other because they technically crossed a jurisdictional line.
Wow.
So most of the things that came through in the interviews and workshops were like anything that can be done procedurally or in regulation to harmonize the building codes, at least at a regional level across the state, to allow factories that are trying to optimize on cost be able to build one or one finite number of things that is lower in cost to produce to supply a whole region at once.
Yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. Let's jump now because I'm also interested in this part of the white paper to risk. and risks that were identified as part of the process. Let's call them financial risks. The risk of a factory, for example, closing down partway through. Can you talk to that issue and how the report or the white paper responds to that, Tyler?
Yes, this is one of the specters that continues to cast a shadow over the California market in particular, is some of those high profile company failures that I mentioned earlier. Specifically, Katera is a huge one, but also some others. There was Vive, though they have since been revived, and Tekra, a panelized builder in California, Blue Homes, Rent the Backyard. There's been quite a few uh, high to medium to low profile companies that have spawned up in this space, tried to do factory-based production, and ended up failing. And though only a couple of those companies, to my knowledge, were operating in the multifamily housing space. A lot of them were doing single family detached or accessory dwelling units, uh, in which case the market dynamic is different. But the couple factories that were operating in the multifamily space basically went bankrupt for a variety of reasons, some of which the report does get into, and left their projects in the lurch. And so there'd be a developer and contractor and the rest of the project team that has a third of their construction scope that was supposed to be provided off-site suddenly vanish and an empty factory to show for it. Some of those projects have had to very frantically pivot to another factory provider and update their designs accordingly because not every factory builds exactly the same thing. Uh, Others have had to transition to do that portion of the project on site, which was just a massive ballooning of the scope of the general contractor and other subs that they had not accounted for in terms of workforce availability. And so most of the projects that I've heard suffered from being left in the lurch by a failing factory partner, had massive delays and other cost impacts from that, and have kind of poisoned the waters to a decent degree. Because we have not had a stable industry, because even the factories that are still operating are not going so swimmingly or so flush with cash that these concerns are
Mhm.
assuaged. And so there's a vicious cycle of factories not being able to get a stable pipeline because there's this fear in the industry. There's being a fear in the industry because the factories are failing. The factories are failing because they can't get a stable pipeline. And so in
Yeah.
terms of how risk is passed on, a lot of the times it's been the developers and the clients really who end up suffering. And so even though there haven't been like the majority of projects using modular or panelized methods have not had this exact issue, enough of them have, and there is enough of a risk of other factories failing, at least in perception, that it's had an outsized impact in the market of how insurance is costed, of what lenders are comfortable providing capital for a factory built housing project and other things.
So this has led to the idea of a kind of backstopping developers and helping them out with the risks that you've just explained. This is quite novel. I'm not aware of anywhere else in the world that's attempted this. Are you aware of any other jurisdiction that's tried this?
Not that I know of. There are, of course, precedents for various mechanisms of economic development trying to stilt up an industry. I think this is where a lot of local, state, even national governments default to like, let's subsidize a new factory and get X amount of jobs. So already it's more in the weeds than I think a lot of typical like industry support mechanisms than I know of, and can say candidly that is one of the biggest conundrums still underway in the list of potential state reforms is trying to figure out exactly how it would work, how the state would assume risk, who at the state would assume risk. There's a couple of different entities that
Hmm.
could ostensibly do it, but it's not is a little bit of square peg round hole, and it would, I think, be a first of its kind as far as we know. And so,
Hmm.
though it came through super clearly as perhaps one of the most impactful things the state could do, that there is really no other substitutive entity that could do that in the industry. It's also one of the things that is the hardest to figure out, from what I've heard from Buffy Wicks and team. And so, it's a
Yeah.
surgical thing that is attempting to not celebrate or choose winners, quote unquote, um, and support developers and other clients that are choosing to be early adopters of these innovative methods in the hopes of getting
Yeah.
cost outcomes. But that makes it that much more complicated to figure out.
Yeah. Well, no one said it was going to be easy. We've obviously been looking, we've been looking at implementing ideas like this for 100 years, and I think it's fairly safe to say that if it were easy, it would have already happened.
Mhm.
Tyler, I want to take you back a month now to the Knowledge Share event that we held at Stanford, where I had the pleasure of listening to you sort of foreshadow some of the things that were likely to come out. In that talk, you gave us a feel for some of the things that um, might be a kind of edge condition, if you like. So I'm going to describe that a little better than I just did then. Namely, things that were discussed as part of the workshops and interviews, but for reasons that I'll let you get into, may be difficult to legislate or may not find their way into a bill. Could you go through some of those issues for us and just give us a feel for some of the things that perhaps the white paper is not?
Sure. And yeah, we were thrilled to be able to be neutral and just create the white paper as a reflection of what we heard, including some ideas that a lot of people pushed back against and said, we don't think this is a good idea, or at least not right now. And one of them is a direct follow-on from what we were just talking about that I think a lot of sort of reflex levers that governments, at least in the US, have pulled has just been to throw money, whether it's grants or low-cost loans, to start up new factories on the premise that we need more factory-based production capacity to be able to meet housing supply in a really directly intuitive way. The problem being, and the reason I think this effort in California is somewhat standalone already, is that we were able to get deeper and realize that even the factories themselves that were hoping to open up more factories and could benefit from a policy lever like that, were like, we're struggling to keep our existing factory alive. Like, this is a famously lumpy housing market that has ups and downs with, even when it's going well, a really unclear pipeline of demand where projects get delayed or canceled or otherwise stalled uh, haphazardly in ways that makes it really hard to plan for factory production. And if we
Mhm.
continue to follow the sort of reflex of starting up new factories, when we already know that factory failure is an active and prescient concern for adoption, then we're just setting up the industry to fail even larger and with more state money at risk. And that was some of the sentiment that got kind of reframed into, okay, what if it's an amount of money that would typically be thrown at an effort like this, but specifically to do this surgical kind of backstop mechanism? And that's part of how that evolved as an idea. So that's one that came through is like actually the industry, new and incumbent companies alike were pretty clear that like that's not going to solve the issue. We need to sort of stabilize the industry and the demand that they can expect to help existing factories succeed and thrive before getting to the point where we use this as a more proactive, like let's get more factory capacity in the state. The other big one that too I think has received a lot of perch in a lot of local, state, and some federal government conversations is the idea of pre-approved plans. And I think this is connecting some of the dots thematically for the industrialized construction world, where like it depends mightily on standardization and consistent output and demand aggregation. And so again, like intuitively, there's a an idea there that if we certify these pre-approved plans, then we can make them pretty and make it a nice little design competition to make them appealing. Then some number of those will be purchased year over year, hopefully be able to fill some of the gaps in factory pipelines to stabilize that demand and give those specific plans the benefit of streamlined permitting and review and things at the local level, which we know is a friction point. The problem, somewhat similarly to the subsidizing or giving grants to new factories, is we don't have a lot of evidence of performance. We have seen some pretty resource and time intensive efforts to come up with design catalogs for really nice looking rendered units, but we've not actually seen any research, and I should say I have not seen any research that ties material outcomes and housing output and affordability to pre-approved design efforts, we have seen more evidence of some of those efforts that the pre-approved designs sit on a shelf. Some of them aren't actually friendly to any of the existing manufacturers' production processes or capabilities. And a lot of people can take issue with the idea of getting a quote unquote cookie cutter home. And so, though that is an instinct and there is some like sentimental tie there to the idea of standardization and the benefits of streamlined permitting, the tack, the thread we heard feedback about and what ended up turning into a version of a bill from the white paper research was the idea of at least getting a reapproval pathway. So from someone that has
Mm.
already completed, gotten all the approvals and actually completed a building, housing structure in particular, get some of the benefits you'd get from a pre-approved plan in theory, but only after doing it within the same jurisdiction or under the same building code and planning regime. And so in that way, it's kind of meeting the industry where they're at. You get to skip the whole upfront effort of creating a design catalog with some really nice rendered units. And you have the proof point of, well, at least one person purchased this home because we built it. It's a completed project. And so
Yeah.
hopefully allowing some, especially factory producers, to benefit from standardization, but without needing to have to filter or screen pre-approved, finite number of pre-approved designs into factory built housing processes.
Yeah, I was really interested when you told me about that reapproval pathway as I was going to say counterpoint, but I think that's too strong. As an option for some of the work that you've correctly identified as sitting in with the pre-approved planned basket. Um, to me, it really struck me, Tyler, as a corollary, if you like, to case law.
Yeah.
If you win a case and it's been ruled upon by a court or a jury, then it goes into case law, and it can be done again and again and again. And I think your assessment is 100% correct from my somewhat more anecdotal engagement with the industry is that if a party has gone to the effort and trouble of creating a solution which is not unsubstantial effort, both in terms of resources and financing, surely a reward could be that the next time that the exact same proposal is put forward in that jurisdiction, as you say, that it could be reapproved. I thought that was quite interesting as well. Have you seen that formalized in other jurisdictions in the research?
Not super formally. I think the precedent that exists, at least in California, was in the ADU space, accessory dwelling units again,
Mm.
and potentially re-upped specifically for wildfire rebuilds in Los Angeles. And I
Hmm.
should say candidly, I'm like, this is arm's length knowledge, so fact check me on this. But I think somewhat recently in California, there have been some pathways for that, specifically for those two market segments. I genuinely do not know what uptake has been, and certainly haven't seen any research that shows any potential monetary or time benefit from the faster approvals you could get from resubmitting a duplicate plan. But I think that's where at least, even if this also has almost no impact compared to some of the less successful pre-approved design efforts, there was at least almost no additional public resources or effort or hullabaloo raised about it. Uh, it's just working within the existing system that we know is fragmented
Mm.
and uncertain. But if we can get the some of the benefits that pre-approved designs are meant to provide through the existing pathways we have, then in this case, I think scaling up those two precedents within California to a wider swath of especially factory built housing uh,
Mm.
might have perch.
Um, the final question I've got for you here, Tyler, is this part of the interview before we move to wrap up here is quite a broad question, and it is there more that could be done to reduce barriers to factory built housing or indeed ramp up production of housing across the board? initiatives, if you like, that sit outside the legislative process. Because obviously, what we've spent a lot of time talking about today is what's in the white paper, and then obviously what via the white paper moves to government. What sits outside the government and its role that you think could reduce barriers to factory built housing and or ramp up production in the housing supply market?
A lot of where Turner sits, and even where there is some gesturing towards this question in the white paper, is the government has a finite list of things it can and should do. And we ourselves, Turner, operates off of a lot of intersectional support from foundation, philanthropic efforts. A lot of our research collaborations have been from folks in the actual industry doing things differently. And of course, that is from the innovators we have in our accelerator program who are finding ever more creative niche ways to weave kind of policy innovation or opportunity spaces with private sector innovation. But also on the flip side, like there are incumbent massive affordable housing developers and for-profit housing developers that are trying to do things differently and desperate to do things differently. And I think the one in particular, because specificity is nice sometimes, I think there is just a wholesale interrogation waiting to happen in the mechanisms behind housing finance. And admittedly, that's not completely non-governmental. We have mortgage-backed programs at the federal level that kind of backstop a lot of the mortgage industry and homeownership, home building sector in the US. So this is all still interconnected and interwoven with legislative or other governmental intervention. But I think like on the ground level of how we in the terms and conditions of financing mechanisms, of construction lending, of how we replace soft debt with permanent debt over time once a project is complete. There is a lot to be said and to interrogate about financing
Hmm.
agencies, like the rigidity of their terms, how they measure, assess risk. It's not all quantitative. I've been in the room with some scarily influential people that hear about policy reform and are like, yeah, but you can't have housing in Los Angeles without parking. I don't care that they don't require parking anymore. It's LA. You have to have parking.
Yeah.
Uh, and there's just a enormous amount of power they wield in basic terminology or criteria that they use to fund or not fund certain housing projects that has massive indirect implications for the role of innovation in that space, and especially in factory built housing, where the drawdown schedules and deposit requirements are simply different than traditional lending models. And so uh, I think to the extent that there is some role for government to play to kind of backstop the risk in the near term while the industry gets mature, uh, that too can set a precedent for there to be kind of private financing industry takeoff in the 5 to 10 year span. But I think even without that kind of governmental role interstitially, there is such a literal wealth of knowledge and potential change making that can happen
Hmm.
with even just minor changes to how financiers and lenders in housing uh, make their decisions.
Really interesting. I think as somebody who's also delved into, at least probably a bit more superficially than yourself, into the financing, I would completely concur that looking in from the outside in the beginning, I thought this was a really highly rational process that was data driven and research backed, and to find out that it can be so subjective and capricious is really quite an interesting turnaround of events for me. So completely agree with that. Tyler, our time is coming to a close, and so I want to move to wrap up now. Um, I want to ask you the same question I asked Assembly Member Wicks, which is, what do you think the future of Californian housing could look like in 5 or 10 years from now? And let's assume that everything goes to plan and that the white paper is very well received in government and industry. How do you think that future looks?
In order of decreasing confidence. The thing I'm most confident in, I will probably have white hairs in the 5 to 10 year span. I think that has been a fate unavoidable, and I'm still barreling down that track. Uh, I think in more material terms, I would love, and I am at risk of genuinely believing this might happen, I would love for there to be a premier one-stop shop physical R&D facility with inter-university collaboration, cross-disciplinary, all the buzzwords you could hope for, with innovators coming directly through programming at that said space, with demonstration projects and exhibitions and actual homes built after leaving that program. I think there's a version of that that also directly translates to more factories in and outside of California. I think, of course, there is some political primacy to wanting to keep jobs local, but with the advent of offsite construction, I don't think it needs to be so narrow. Of course, transportation costs and related emissions exist, so local is has some benefit in and of itself, but just more factories providing to California, and even the factories doesn't have to be a limit, just like more innovative construction providers helping solve the supply constraints through cost reductions in California, however they manage to do it. Um, and related to that, a better, and this is truly wonky dream, like a database of sorts, make it public, open source, ideally, but just a better place to find reliable, filtered, clean data and evidence on building industry performance writ large.
Yeah.
I think we suffer from a complete lack of benchmarking, at least through publicly available and reliable sources, in terms of basic cost, time, quality outcomes. And if kind of to my original motivation for getting into industrialized construction, if this can be the wedge in the door to improve insight and transparency of the building industry writ large as a means to improve performance over time, I think that would be great.
Yeah.
So I won't commit to percent cost savings or number of homes built in 5 to 10 years, but if we can set a stronger foundation of data and evidence to even better demonstrate and track the impact of different policy and industry reforms over time, oh, that would be the dream.
Here, here. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Maybe you've already answered my last question, but I'll give it to you anyway, Tyler. Um, I like to close with getting thoughtful people's views on where we might be headed and how things could look. So, with an eye to the future, but maybe not a Jetsons future, but rooted here in the present. What do you think we should be
Mhm.
paying more attention to in building?
Ooh, that is a very good question. I think the role of academia, and not just in a general sense of more industry aligned research, because that's too vague, but interrogating like what are the curricular criteria we use to accredit university programs? What are the skills we actually dictate architects require to have an architecture degree? And how does that translate into licensure? And that's not university necessarily, but like the actual least imaginable sexy parts of how architects become architects, how engineers become engineers, how contractors learn to do their work, how people train into the on-site trades. Like an interrogation of what are the institutional levers we have to change those factors of who is getting into the industry and even more importantly, who isn't. And then what skills are they coming out with? Because we continue to talk about this in the industry. Kind of everyone says it almost apologetically, but with fervor, unlike, oh, I'm a recovering architect or I'm a recovering engineer. And we all talk about the need for interdisciplinary work and collaboration, and big room innovation is still a thing we talk about excitedly. And yet we haven't changed anything about the pipeline of people we have coming into the industry and the actual skills we train them with and the mindset we train them into about being siloed and everyone else being kind of antagonistic or adversarial. So the role universities play in that, in continuing to funnel the wrong sort of thinking into the industry, I think is massively under interrogated.
Yeah,
Universities are hard to change too.
yeah. Thanks, Tyler. I really think that's a really interesting point that certainly none of the other guests that I've had on over the years have raised. So thanks for that. I really appreciate your perspective. I also really want to thank you again, Tyler, for your time today. I'd appreciate it if you could pass on my regards to the rest of the Terner team. And to our audience, I would say, as always, notes and references will be added online to the show notes. And I want to thank you again, Tyler, for your generosity in joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a joy.